The high rattle of the brake lever was the only sound that mattered. It cut through the persistent, scraping wind that swept across the frozen plains and funneled down the main, muddy track of gravel ridge. The town looked like it had been carved from gray rock and old grudges. Two lines of false-fronted buildings stared at each other across the frozen ruts. Nothing moved between them but the wind and a few scraps of paper that danced with a dry, desperate sound. The stagecoach, a mud-caked box of misery, groaned to a halt. The horses blew hard, their breath pluming in the air, their flanks dark with sweat that was already beginning to frost. Two men, bundled in buffalo coats, climbed down, grunting as their boots hit the iron-hard ground. They slapped their arms for warmth and headed straight for the saloon, disappearing behind a door that shut with a solid finality. Clara waited. She was the last one. Her body ached with a stiffness that went clear to the bone, a deep, resonant pain from the jolting of the coach and the sickness that lived inside her. She gathered the thin gray wool scarf closer to her mouth, the material damp and cold. The driver, a thick man whose face was hidden by a beard frosted with ice, yanked the door open. He didn't look at her. "End of the line, ma'am," he growled. Clara moved, but her limbs were water. She fumbled for the doorframe, her gloveless fingers raw and white. She tried to step down, but her foot missed the iron step. She didn't fall, not quite. She stumbled, catching herself against the wheel, the cold of the metal searing through her thin coat. A cough seized her. It was not a small, polite thing. It was a dry hacking sound that tore up from her lungs, bending her double. She pressed the scarf to her lips, tasting the faint, metallic tang of blood. No one moved to help. The driver was already hauling mail sacks. The men who had been inside the general store, watching her arrival, turned back to their conversations. A woman crossing the street with a basket saw her, hesitated, and then pulled her shawl tighter and walked faster. Clara straightened, her breath shallow. The driver tossed her single embattered carpetbag into the frozen mud near her feet. It was light. It held all she had. He climbed back onto his seat, gathered the reins, and with a curse and a crack of the whip, the coach lumbered away, leaving her alone in the center of the hostile quiet. She picked up the bag, her knuckles grazing the ice in the mud. She stood for a moment, swaying, the wind cutting through her clothes as if they were made of lace. She had to find shelter. Night was coming, and in this part of Montana, night was a killer. Her first stop was the hotel. It was the tallest building, 2 stories of grim, unpainted wood with the word proprietor painted on the glass. The lobby was warm. It smelled of boiled coffee and stale cigar smoke. A heavy-set woman with hair pulled into a knot so tight it seemed to hurt her face stood behind a desk. "I need a room," Clara said. Her voice was a hoarse whisper. The woman, Mrs. Finch, didn't look up from her ledger. "Rooms are 4 bits, in advance." I don't have 4 bits, but I can work. I can clean rooms. I can cook. I'm a hard worker." The woman finally looked up. Her eyes, small and dark, traveled over Clara, lingering on the hollows of her cheeks, the faint, bluish tint of her skin, the way her hand trembled as she held her bag. "We ain't needin' help," Mrs. Finch said. Her voice was flat. "Please," Clara whispered. "Just for the night. A cot, the kitchen floor. It's so cold." As if summoned, the cough returned, worse this time. It shook her entire frame. She turned away, hiding her face in the scarf. But the sound was unavoidable. It was the sound of broken things. When she finished, gasping for air, the lobby was silent. 2 men by the pot-bellied stove had stopped talking. They were watching her. "Consumptive," one of them muttered, not bothering to lower his voice. "Mrs.?" Finch's face hardened. "Get out," she said. It was not a suggestion. "We run a clean house. We don't take in sickness." "I'm not," Clara began. but her own weakness betrayed her. "Get out, before I call the sheriff." Shame burned hotter than the fever in her cheeks. She backed out of the door, the warmth of the lobby snatched away, the cold slapping her face like an open palm. She tried the general store next. It smelled of dried apples and kerosene. The proprietor, a thin man with spectacles, was weighing out beans for a customer. "Ma'am," he asked, his tone already impatient. "Do you have work? Sweeping? Stocking?" He shook his head. "Nothing." Could I perhaps have some credit? Just for a blanket? A heavy one." The man looked at the other customers. He saw the way they were looking at Clara. "We don't run tabs for travelers," he said loudly. "For their benefit. And I'd thank you not to be breathing on the foodstuffs." She left. She was starting to stumble now. The cold was a physical weight, pressing her down. She saw the saloon, the gilded cage, its windows painted red. She knew what they would think, but desperation was a sharp stone in her boot. She pushed the door open. The blast of hot air, sour with whiskey and unwashed bodies, almost knocked her over. A piano tinkled weakly in the corner. A man with a heavy mustache and a dirty apron was wiping the bar. He saw her and laughed. It was a cruel, barking sound. "You lost, little bird? We only hire girls who can stand up straight, and you look like a stiff wind would break you in two." The men at the bar laughed with him. Someone called out something ugly. She fled, pulling the door shut on their voices. She had nowhere else to go. The churches were dark, the houses were shuttered. Yellow light glowing in the windows. Warmth and life locked away from her. She leaned against the wall of the blacksmith's shop, the rough wood digging into her back. She closed her eyes. Just for a minute. "Ma'am." The voice was deep, weary, and carried the weight of the law. She opened her eyes. The sheriff stood before her. He was an older man, his face a map of sun and wind, his eyes a pale, tired gray. He wasn't unkind. That made it worse. "Ma'am," Sheriff Brody said again, "I'm afraid you can't stay here." "I just need a place," she pleaded. "A barn, a stable. I won't bother anyone." "I can't let you," he said. He didn't look angry. He looked sad, which was somehow more final. "It's the town council. We have to be careful. We had a bad winter last year. Lost 3 children to lung fever. Folks are scared of sickness." He looked her over, and his gaze was more thorough than Mrs. Finch's had been. He saw the fineness of her coat. Though it was worn, he saw the way she held herself, despite the shakes. "And we don't abide trouble," he added, his voice dropping. "We like a quiet town. Best you take the morning road out. South is your best bet. There's nothing for you in Gravel Ridge." He was dismissing her. He was pointing her toward the wilderness to die. "Where am I to sleep tonight?" she asked, the words raw in her throat. Sheriff Brody looked away, up at the darkening sky. "That ain't my jurisdiction, ma'am. I'm just telling you the policy. You can't stay in town." He tipped his hat, a gesture of hollow politeness, and turned. His boots made a solid, determined sound on the wooden boardwalk as he walked away. The law had spoken. Clara was alone, truly alone. She started walking. She didn't know where. She just walked away from the lights, away from the sounds of the town. Her feet were numb, heavy things she had to drag. She followed the track that the sheriff had pointed out. The road south. It led down a small incline, toward a creek. The water was frozen solid, a ribbon of milky ice between dark, snow-dusted banks lined with barren cottonwoods. The wind was worse here, a razor that found every gap in her clothing. She couldn't go on. Her legs wouldn't obey. She saw a large, fallen log near the creek bed, partly sheltered by the high bank. She made her way to it, clumsy as a drunk. She didn't have the strength to walk another step. She sank down onto the frozen earth, her back against the rough bark. The cough came again, a fit that left her dizzy and breathless. spots dancing in her vision. This is it, she thought. This is the place. She had been cast out of Denver for a lie, and she would die in Montana for a cough. She pulled her knees to her chest, dropped her head, and let the first hot tears freeze on her cheeks. She didn't know how long she sat there. The world had shrunk to the sound of the wind in the branches and the pounding ache in her chest. Then a new sound, the crunch of boots on frozen gravel. She looked up, panicked, her heart hammered. Was it the sheriff, come to force her to move on, or one of the men from the saloon, come to... He was just a shadow at first, detaching himself from the deeper darkness near the livery. He was tall, and he moved with a slow, deliberate economy. He led a single, sturdy-looking horse. He was a cowboy, but he wasn't one of the loud, whiskey-soaked men she'd seen earlier. He was something else. He stopped about 10 feet from her. He wore a long, canvas duster, and his hat was pulled so low it hid his face completely. He just stood there, watching her. His horse dipped its head, nudging his arm. Clara tried to pull herself up, to look stronger than she was. "I'm leaving," she croaked. "I'm just resting my legs." The man said nothing. He looped his horse's reins over a low-hanging branch. He didn't approach her. He walked past her, toward the creek bed. She watched, confused, as he began pulling dry branches and deadfall from the tangle, his movements practiced and efficient. He dropped the wood in a small clearing a few yards from her log. He returned to his horse, pulled a small bundle from his saddlebag. Tinder. He knelt by the wood, his back to her. She heard the sharp, metallic shing of a flint and steel. A spark caught. He blew on it, a low, steady breath. A tiny flame licked up, catching the dry tinder. In moments, a small, bright fire was crackling, defiant in the gloom. He still hadn't spoken to her. He went back to his horse. He unhooked his canteen. He walked toward her. Clara flinched, pulling back against the log. He stopped immediately. He held the canteen out, but she didn't move. He sighed, a small puff of white air, and set the canteen on the ground, a few feet from her hand. "You need water," he said. His voice was low, rough, like scraping rock. It was the first time he'd spoken. He walked back to the fire and stood beside it, warming his hands. He seemed to be ignoring her, but she knew he was not. He was watching the town. He was listening to the wind. Clara stared at the canteen. Her throat was sandpaper. Slowly, her hand trembling so badly she almost dropped it. She reached for it. She fumbled with the cap. The water was shockingly cold, but it was life. She drank, just a little, then capped it and set it down. The man turned his head, just enough to show the hard line of his jaw. Daniel Cole. He was new to Gravel Ridge, too, but unlike her, he carried his shelter on his back and his authority in his silence. He had been standing near the livery, watching the whole town turn her away, piece by piece. He had watched the sheriff sentence her to the cold. The fire was a living thing. Its warmth reached her, a fragile promise. It thawed the numbness in her fingers and toes. It did not, however, thaw the fear. Men did not do things for free, not for women like her, or, at least, for women they thought were like her. She waited for the demand. The light was almost gone. The purple of the sky had bruised to a deep, starless black. The lights of Gravel Ridge were yellow squares of judgment, warm windows enclosing a world that had no place for her. He would go to one of them now. He would go to the saloon, buy a whiskey, and find a bed. He had done his good deed. Daniel Cole went to his horse. Clara watched him, her stomach tightening. This was it. He was leaving. The fire would die, and the cold would come back. And this time, it would finish the job. He didn't untie the reins. Instead, he uncinched his saddle roll from behind the cantle. He pulled a large, folded piece of canvas from it as well. He walked back to the fire. He didn't ask. He just tossed the heavy bedroll down on the other side of the flames. It landed with a solid thump. He was not close enough to be a threat, but he was not far enough to be separate. He was sharing the circle of light. Clara stared at the wool blanket. "You ain't sleeping alone out here," he said. It was not an offer. It was a statement of fact. Her breath hitched. Fear and shame and a sudden, terrible hope warred inside her. "You can't," she whispered, the words stolen by the wind. You don't know." He didn't look at her. He was looking at the town, at the uncaring lights. "I'm sick," she said, louder, the confession tearing at her. They think I'm consumptive. You'll catch it." He shrugged, a small movement of his broad shoulders. He hunkered down by the fire, adding a larger piece of wood. The flames leaped. "You shouldn't be here," she tried again, her voice thin and desperate. "They'll run you out, too. The sheriff said—" "The sheriff works for them," Daniel said. He finally looked at her. His face was shadowed by his hat, but she could see the glint of his eyes in the firelight. They were as gray and cold as the sheriff's, but there was something different in them. Not pity, something harder, recognition. He nodded toward the town. "Town's not worth freezing over." It was not kindness. It was not charity. It was defiance. He was an outcast by choice, and he had just drawn a line in the snow. He was on her side of it. Clara said nothing more. She had no more words. He took the canvas tarp and, with a few efficient motions, rigged it against the high bank and a low branch, creating a lean-to that would cut the wind. It was a meager shelter, but it was more than anyone else had offered. He sat on his bedroll, his back to the canvas, his face to the fire. He was too proud to ask her why she was there. She was too broken to ask him why he was staying. They sat in silence. The only sounds were the crackle of the flames, the nervous stamp of the horse, and the rising howl of the wind as it drove the temperature down. They were two ruined people, huddled around a small fire, with a whole town of hate and fear at their backs. Clara pulled her thin scarf tighter. She watched the flames. She watched the man who sat across from her, a solid, unmoving shadow. He pulled a small tin of tobacco from his duster, rolled a cigarette, and lit it with a twig from the fire. The cherry glowed in the darkness. Then the first flakes began to fall. They were small and hard at first, hissing as they died in the fire. But they grew, fat and heavy, swirling in the wind, landing on the canvas, on Daniel's hat, on Clara's hair. The snow was a soft, white curtain, closing them in, burying the tracks, and wiping the world away. Clara woke to a world of absolute gray. The snow had not stopped, but had softened to a fine, whispering powder that coated everything in a layer of pristine white. It was beautiful, and it was deadly. The fire was a circle of black, hissing embers. She was colder than she had ever been. The cold was not on her skin, it was inside her bones, a deep, crystalline ache that made movement a misery. For a long moment, she lay still, convinced that this was how it ended, frozen to the ground by a creek in a town that did not want her name. A shadow moved. Daniel Cole was already standing, his back to her, looking at his horse. The animal was thick with frost, its head low. He had not left. The realization brought a hot, sharp rush of shame. He had stayed. He had watched her sleep, a pathetic, sick bundle of rags. She tried to sit up, but the movement sent a fit of coughing through her. It was a dry, shallow hack that offered no relief, only pain. He turned. His hat was low, his face unreadable in the dim light. He walked over to her, his steps crunching in the new snow. He was carrying his canteen and a strip of something dark. "Water," he said. His voice was a rasp. She shook her head, pulling the thin scarf higher over her mouth. "Leave me be." He didn't move. He hunkered down, not too close, and set the canteen beside her. "You'll die of thirst before the cold gets you," He pushed the jerky toward her. "Eat." "I don't want your charity," she snapped. The words were weak, but the venom was real. Kindness was a currency she couldn't afford, and it always came with a price she was no longer willing to pay. He looked at her, and for the first time she saw his eyes. They were a pale, flat gray, the color of the sky, and they held no pity. They held a profound, weary impatience. "It ain't charity," he said. "It's jerky. Eat it or don't. But I'm not going to sit here and watch you freeze." He was not coaxing. He was stating a fact. He reached out, not for her, but for the canvas tarp. He gave it a hard shake, sending a cascade of snow to the ground. He was practical. He was a man who survived. He turned back to her, and before she could protest, he put one hand on her shoulder and the other on her arm, and hauled her into a sitting position. Clara cried out, a small, startled sound. His grip was not gentle, but it was not cruel. It was strong. It was functional. She was a sack of oats he needed to move. She stiffened, expecting something, a rough word, a harder touch. He just let her go, leaving her propped against the log. The brief, rough contact had left her trembling. "I don't need help," she lied. "Right," he said. He went to work on the fire, using his hatchet to splinter dry wood from the heart of a log. He had a small tinder box, and within minutes, a new, hungry flame was licking at the snow. He left the jerky by her hand. She stared at it. It was food. It was life. She was so hungry her stomach felt like a cold, hollow stone. "Why?" she whispered, the question torn from her. "Why are you still here? They'll run you out. They'll say I'm—" "My horse is tired," he said, not looking at her. He nodded to the animal. "Needs a day." It was a lie, a simple, plain lie offered as a courtesy. "They think I'm sick," she pressed, needing him to understand the risk. "They think I'm a saloon girl. They think I'm cursed." Daniel stopped poking the fire. He looked at the town, just visible up the rise, a few chimneys puffing smoke into the gray air. "This town," he said, his voice low, "is full of men who'd step over a dying woman to get to church on time. Their opinion don't mean much." He turned back to his work. "I told you, it ain't worth freezing over." He busied himself with his horse, rubbing it down with a handful of dry grass, checking its hooves. Clara watched him. He had given her an answer that was not an answer. He was not staying for her. He was staying against them. She looked down at the jerky. Her hand, raw and blue with cold, crept out. She took it. She ate. It was hard, salty, and tasted of smoke, and it was the best thing she had ever eaten. As the meager warmth of the food spread through her, she looked at the fire, and the flames began to blur. The smell of the smoke, sharp and clean, faded. It was replaced by the smell of starch and lye soap. She was in Denver, not in the street, but in the laundry room of the Harrison house on Capitol Hill. It was warm there, the air thick with steam from the copper tubs. She had been a housemaid. It was the best position she had ever had. Clara had been proud of that job. She was invisible, yes, but she was clean. She had her own small room in the attic, a real mattress, and 3 meals a day. She scrubbed floors until her knees were raw, polished silver until her fingers ached, and never, ever spoke unless spoken to. Mr. Harrison was a man of some importance. He smelled of bay rum and expensive cigars. He had a loud, booming laugh and a wife who was pale and thin as a winter reed. A woman who spent her days at teas, complaining about the altitude and the dust. The trouble had not come all at once. It had been a stray glance in the hallway, a hand that rested on the newel post, blocking her path. Just for a second, a question. "Clara, are you happy here?" Spoken too softly in a room that was supposed to be empty. She had kept her eyes down. "Yes, sir. Very happy, sir." Then, the afternoon misses. Harrison had gone to a meeting of the ladies' auxiliary. Clara was tasked with bringing fresh linens to the master's study. He was supposed to be at his office. He was not. He was there, by the fire, a glass of whiskey in his hand. "Ah, Clara," he'd said. "Just the girl." She set the towels down. "Will that be all, sir?" "No," he said. He walked over. He was a large man, and he blocked the light from the door. "You're a pretty thing, you know that? Too pretty to be scrubbing pots." He touched her hair. She had it pulled back, as always, tight and severe, but a piece had come loose. He tucked it behind her ear. His fingers were warm and soft. Clara froze. She did not move. She did not breathe. She had been warned by the other girls. The cook, the laundress. Be a ghost, girl. Men like that, they don't see ghosts. He had seen her. "Sir, I—" "Hush," he'd said, and he'd put his hand on her waist, pulling her closer. His breath was sour with whiskey. And in that precise, terrible moment, the front door opened. Mrs. Harrison was home. She had come up the stairs, seen her husband's hand on the maid's waist, seen the maid's face, not fighting, not screaming, just pale and still with terror. Mrs. Harrison had seen what she needed to see, or perhaps what she had been looking for. She did not scream at her husband. She screamed at Clara. "Slattern!" The word was a slap. "Hussy, how dare you! In my own home, seducing my husband!" "No, ma'am," Clara had whispered, her voice gone. I wouldn't." "Get your things!" "Mrs. Harrison had shrieked, her face a mask of white rage. "Get out of my house!" Mr. Harrison, to his credit, had looked ashamed for a moment, but he said nothing. He just turned, set his glass down, and straightened his vest. Clara was on the street within the hour. No wages, no reference. The other servants, her friends, had barred the door, their face flat with fear. She was cast out. The cough had started a week later, in a 5-cent-a-night boarding house with a leaking roof and a mattress that smelled of mold. The shame, the cold, the terror. It had found a place to live, deep in her lungs. She had spent her last dollar on the stagecoach ticket west, to Montana, a place she'd heard was so new, a body's past couldn't follow. The past, it seemed, had ridden on the coach right beside her. A sharp crackle from the fire brought her back. Daniel was on his feet. He had his duster on, his hat pulled low. "Stay here," he said. "Don't move from the fire." "Where are you going?" she asked, a new panic rising. "Supplies." He didn't wait for an answer. He untied his horse, swung up into the saddle, and rode up the bank, toward the town. Clara watched him go. She was alone again, but this time with a fire. She pulled the single and thin blanket from her carpet bag and wrapped it around her shoulders. It was not enough. Daniel Cole walked into the general store. The same half-dozen men were crowded around the pot-bellied stove, the same ones who had watched Clara stumble off the stagecoach. When he entered, the conversation died. The proprietor, Mr. Slocum, looked up, his face tightening. Daniel walked to the counter. He ignored the stares. He could feel them on his back, heavy and cold. "Need oats," he said, his voice quiet. 5 pounds, salt pork, coffee, a sack of beans. Slocum licked his pencil. "Got cash." Daniel placed $3 silver on the worn wooden counter. The sound was loud in the silence. Slocum began to measure out the goods, his movements slow. "Mr. A voice drawled from the stove. It was Hatcher, a big man with a tobacco-stained beard. "You're that fella sleeping by the creek." Daniel didn't turn. "I'm the fella buying beans." "You're with that sick woman." It was not a question. "You're poisoning the air, is what you're doing." Another man chimed in. bringing lung fever to town. Daniel finished putting his coins down. She's cold, not sick. Hatcher laughed. A short, ugly bark. That's what they all say. Cold, or tired, or just plain used up. We know her kind. My wife saw her trying to get into the saloon yesterday. She's sleeping by a fire, Daniel said. His voice was dangerously low. Same as any man traveling through. She ain't a man, Hatcher said, spitting a stream of tobacco juice that sizzled on the stove. And you ain't no better. Keeping her out there, it's indecent. Indecent, Daniel repeated. He turned his head slowly, his gray eyes flat and cold. Indecent is letting a person freeze when you're sitting by a hot stove. The men shuffled. Slocum pushed the bag of supplies across the counter. That'll be $2.40, mister. Take your things and go. Daniel put his supplies in his saddlebag, which he'd carried in. Need one more thing, a blanket, a heavy one. Slocum shook his head. Ain't got blankets for sale. Not that'd suit you. Daniel knew a lie when he heard one. He could see a stack of heavy gray wool blankets on a shelf behind the counter. He was about to speak when the door opened again. It was Mrs. Finch, the proprietor of the hotel. She had a face like a closed fist. "Sheriff Brody," she called, not looking at Daniel, but at Slocum. "I'm looking for the sheriff." "He's at the smithy, ma'am," Slocum said. "Well, you tell him," she announced, "that this man is still here, and he's brought that woman with him. He's built a fire by the creek like some kind of heathen, and I want him gone. He's buying up supplies. What if he's diseased too?" Daniel looked at her. He tipped his hat. "Ma'am." "Mrs." Finch recoiled as if he'd struck her. "Don't you ma'am me. I know what you are, and I won't have it. I came here to build a respectable town, not a vagrant camp." Daniel picked up his bag. He left the remaining change on the counter. He walked out of the store, the silence behind him as thick as the snow. He knew he wouldn't get a blanket. When he returned, the panic in Clara's eyes was so stark, she didn't have to speak. He was her only tether, and she'd been watching him, terrified he would ride on. He dropped the sack of food. "We're moving." He didn't explain. He kicked out the fire, packed his few things. He helped her onto his horse, his hands strong and impersonal at her waist. She was light as a child. He walked beside her, leading the horse, moving them further down the creek, away from the prying eyes of the town. He found what he was looking for, a bluff, a high rock overhang facing south, sheltered from the north wind by a thick stand of pine. "Here," he said. He helped her down. For the next hour, he worked. He built a new fire, setting it close to the rock to bounce the heat. Then he took his hatchet and began to cut. He harvested armloads of thick, fragrant pine boughs. What are you doing?" Clara asked. She was huddled by the new fire, her hands outstretched. "Insulation," he said. "Ground'll steal your heat faster than the air." He laid the first layer of boughs on the ground under the overhang, their tips pointing down. Then he laid another layer, and another, weaving them into a thick, springy mattress, a green, living floor that smelled of resin and winter. "Now you," he said. "Me? Help me. We need to line the sides." He showed her how to break the smaller branches, how to tuck them into the cracks of the rock wall. At first, her fingers were too numb, too clumsy, but the work, the simple, repetitive motion, began to warm her. She was doing something. She was building something. It was a small, three-sided nest, a den. It was crude, but it was shelter. When they were finished, they stood back. It was almost dark again. The wind howled over their heads, but in their small cove, the firelight was steady. Daniel made coffee, boiling it in a small, soot-blackened pot. He made a thin gruel from the oats, and they ate in silence. The food was hot. It was enough. Clara felt a stitch of strength return. Not much, but enough to notice the man across from her. He had taken his duster off to work, and now he was putting it back on. The shoulder seam was ripped, a long, gaping tear. Before she could second-guess herself, she reached into her battered carpet bag. She pulled out her housewife, a small roll of flannel that held her needles, a spool of black thread, and a small tin thimble. It had been her mother's. "Take off your coat," she said. He looked at her, his eyes suspicious in the firelight. "It's torn," she said, holding up the needle. "The wind will get in. I can mend it." He hesitated. To give up his coat was to give up a layer of his armor, but he looked at the tear, then at her. He saw the needle, the thread. He saw a skill, not a demand. He shrugged the heavy duster off and handed it to her. She took it. The canvas was stiff, cold, and smelled of him. Smoke, hoarse, and the faint, metallic tang of the cold air. She sat cross-legged, pulled the coat into her lap, and threaded the needle. Her hands were chapped, her knuckles split, but her fingers knew the work. She began to sew, her stitches small, tight, and even. A perfect, strong seam. She lost herself in the rhythm, the simple pull, push, tighten of the thread. Daniel did not speak. He watched her. He did not watch her face. He watched her hands. He watched the way they moved, efficiently, without wasted motion. He watched the firelight catch the silver of the needle. This was not a saloon girl's hands. These were the hands of a worker. She finished. She bit the thread, the small snap loud in the quiet. She held the coat out to him. "It's done." He reached for it. As he took the heavy garment, his fingers brushed the back of her hand. It was a simple, accidental touch, but it burned. Clara snatched her hand back as if she'd touched the fire. Her breath caught. He froze, the coat halfway on. The air, which had been still, was suddenly charged. It was the first human touch she had felt. That was not a fall, or a stumble, or a functional haul in so long. She could not remember. He looked at her. Her face was flushed, her eyes wide, locked on his. He pulled the coat on, his movements stiff. He nodded once, appreciated. He turned away, busying himself with the horse, checking the tethers, giving it the last of the oats. The silence that fell was different. It was no longer the silence of strangers. It was the silence of two people who had just become aware of each other. Night fell. The second night. The wind was a demon, shrieking over the bluff. The snow was a solid, white wall beyond their fire, but in their small den of pine boughs. It was almost still. It was not warm. Daniel laid his bedroll on the pine boughs. It was a single, worn wool blanket. It was not enough for two. "You take it," he said. "No," she said. "It's yours. I'll be fine by the fire." "You'll be dead by morning," he said flatly. "Don't be a fool. Get under it." She hesitated, then crawled onto the pine. She pulled the blanket over her. It was heavy, and it carried his scent. He sat on the other side of the fire, his back against the rock, his hat pulled low. He was going to sit up all night. "You'll freeze," she said. "I've been colder." An hour passed. The fire began to die down. The cold, which had been held at bay, crept in. Clara was shaking. It started in her legs, then her back, until her teeth were rattling so hard she had to clench her jaw. She could not stop it. "I can't," she chattered. "I can't get warm." Daniel watched her. His face was a mask of shadows. He cursed, a low, soft sound. "Move over." She scrambled to the side. He didn't get under the blanket. He lay on top of it, on his side, his back to her, creating a human wall against the night. It helped, a little. Another hour. The shaking was worse. She was losing the fight. She heard him sigh. It was a sound of pure exasperation. "Damn it!" He moved. He sat up, then lay down on the boughs beside her, and with one swift, impersonal motion, He pulled the heavy blanket over both of them. They lay side by side, two bodies under one cover, rigid as corpses. They were not touching. A respectable 6-inch ribbon of freezing air separated them. But Clara could feel the heat radiating from him. He was a furnace. She was a block of ice. Her shivering was so violent it was shaking the blanket. She turned her head. He was a shadow beside her, staring up at the rock ceiling. "I haven't been touched in kindness in years," she whispered. The words were a confession, forced from her by the cold. It was half plea, half warning. "I am not what they say, but I am not clean either. I am just cold." He said nothing. The wind howled. He moved. It was not a sudden act. It was a slow, deliberate decision. He moved closer, just an inch, then another. Under the blanket, his hand was near hers. She could feel the warmth. She waited. He waited. Her fingers, stiff and numb, uncurled. They moved. A tiny, searching motion, until the tip of her index finger brushed the rough wool of his glove. He didn't move. She moved her hand again, bolder this time, her cold fingers sliding against the back of his hand, the one that was bare. It was rough, calloused, scarred. He did not pull away. He did not grab her. Clara slid her icy fingers into his palm. He closed his hand. The shock of it was so profound, it stopped her breath. His hand was huge, hard, and so very warm. It was an anchor. Tears sprang to her eyes, hot and immediate, freezing on her cheeks. "If we die out here," she whispered, her voice thick, "I want to remember what warmth feels like." He exhaled, a long, slow breath that plumed in the air. He did not kiss her. He did not pull her close. He did not speak. But he moved again. He turned onto his side, facing her. He shifted, closing the last inches of space between them. He pulled the blanket up, tucking it roughly around her shoulder. Clara, trembling, shuffled closer, pressing her back against his chest. He was a solid wall of heat. He was life. It was not passion. It was not desire. It was something far more raw and elemental. It was survival. It was two ruined people, two outcasts, daring to share a single blanket, a single pocket of warmth, against a world that wanted them dead. The violent shivers began to ease. The deep, bone cold began to recede. She fell asleep, her hand still locked in his, breathing in the scent of pine and smoke. Daniel Cole stayed awake long into the night, staring into the darkness, listening to the snow and the sound of her breathing. The sound of the axe was a sharp, lonely crack in the frozen air. It was the only sound. The wind had died, and the world was holding its breath, buried under a foot of new snow. Daniel Cole's breath plumed in front of his face with every swing. The effort warmed him, but it was a shallow warmth that the cold leached away instantly. He was a half-mile from their shelter, working on the edge of a vast, fenced-in plain, Miller's Land. He'd seen the sign, shot full of holes, nailed to a post. But the trees near the creek bed were gone, or too green to burn. He needed dry, standing wood. He was trespassing. He knew it, and he did not care. He worked with a grim, efficient rhythm. Swing, bite, swing, bite. The pine was thick. He was not just gathering for the day. He was building a stockpile. He was settling in. "That's far enough, mister." The voice came from behind him, hard and flat. Daniel stopped. The axe held low. He did not turn. He listened. Two horses standing still in the deep snow. He slowly turned. Two men sat on horseback, their rifles resting across their pommels. They wore thick buffalo coats and hard, pinched faces, ranch hands. "That wood ain't yours," the first man said. He was older, with a beard so thick with ice it looked like solid white wood. "I need it," Daniel said. His voice was quiet, but it carried in the still air. "What you need," the second younger man said, "is to keep moving. We saw your smoke. We know you're holed up by the creek. We ain't bothering anyone, Daniel said. He rested the axe head in the snow. You're bothering Mr. Miller, the older man said. He don't like vagrants, and he don't like sickness. We heard about you, and we heard about the girl you got with you. She ain't sick, Daniel lied, his voice flat. The younger man spat a brown stream of tobacco juice into the perfect white snow. That ain't what we hear in town. They say she's consumptive. They say she's a whore. We don't want that kind of trash near our stock. Daniel's hand tightened on the hickory handle of the axe. He said nothing. You got till sundown, the older man said, his voice dropping to a final, cold command. We want your fire out. We want you gone. If you're still here come morning, we'll drag you out, sick girl or no. They didn't wait for a reply. They reined their horses around, the animals' hooves making a soft, plunging sound as they moved back toward the open plain. Daniel watched them go. He looked at the half-cut tree. He took a breath, raised the axe, and swung. Hard. The tree groaned, splintered, and fell with a heavy whoosh, sending a cloud of snow into the air. He was not leaving at sundown, but he would have to tell Clara. He returned an hour later, dragging a heavy load of split pine on his canvas tarp. The effort had left him sweating. Clara was waiting by the fire, her face turned toward the path, the fear in her eyes, a constant, dull shadow, sharpened when she saw his expression. He dropped the wood and didn't look at her. He began to stack it, his movements too precise, too angry. What is it? She asked. Her voice was stronger than it had been 2 days ago, but it was still thin, like fine glass. Ranch hands, he said. He didn't stop stacking. From the Miller place. This is their land. Clara's hand went to her mouth. They saw us. They saw the smoke. They want us gone by sundown. She didn't cry. She had no tears left for this kind of cruelty. She just seemed to shrink, the small bit of strength she had gathered, the faint color the fire had put in her cheeks. It all drained away. She looked down at her hands, twisting the edge of the thin blanket in her lap. I see, she whispered. Daniel finished stacking the last piece of wood. He stood up, turning to face her. We'll have to move on. Find a different spot, further up. Clara shook her head, a small, slow, miserable motion. No, not we. What? You, she said. She finally looked up, and her eyes were a terrible mix of gratitude and despair. You have to move on. I will stay when they come. I'll tell them you left. Daniel just stared at her. You'll what? You've done enough, she said, the words spilling out in a rush. You've kept me alive for 2 days. You gave me your blanket. You shared your food. You mended my coat. She was confusing him with herself, her mind tangled in gratitude. I won't be the reason I won't. I'm a curse. Daniel, I bring all of this. Stop talking stupid, he said, his voice a low growl. We pack, we move. No, she scrambled to her feet, a sudden, surprising burst of energy. She was frail, but she was vibrating with a terrible, final resolve. You don't understand. I am poison. The town sees it. Those men see it. Why don't you? Leave me. Please, just go. Saddle your horse and ride out. Don't look back. He took a step toward her. I ain't leaving you. Why? She shrieked, the word tearing from her raw throat. Why? Because you feel sorry for me? Because I'm a stray dog you found by the creek? Is that it? Pity? You're staying out here, freezing and starving, for a woman you don't know, out of pity. The accusation hung in the air, sharp as an icicle. It was the one thing he could not abide. It was the one thing that broke his iron control. He strode forward, grabbing her by the shoulders. His grip was hard, not gentle, and it shocked her into silence. His gray eyes were on fire, blazing at her from under the shadow of his hat. It ain't pity, he snarled. his face inches from hers. Pity is what those women in town have. Pity is what the sheriff has. This ain't that. Then what is it? She whispered, trembling in his grasp. He held her, his knuckles white. He was looking at her, but she sensed he was seeing something else, something far behind them, a long way off. It's choice, he said, the word a piece of rock torn from his own chest. It's my choice, and I'm not running. He let her go, almost pushing her away. He turned his back on her, running his hands through his hair, his whole body rigid with a force she could not understand. Clara sank back down, breathing hard, her shoulders aching where he had grabbed her. She had pushed him, and he had not broken. He had pushed back. The silence that fell was worse than the argument. It was heavy and raw and full of unsaid things. He went to check his horse. She huddled by the fire, her heart hammering. The sun began to dip, painting the snow in shades of pale, cold lavender. Sundown. The ranch hands did not come. The threat had been for the morning. Daniel made a pot of beans, thick with a piece of salt pork. He made coffee. He handed her a tin plate. They ate without speaking, the only sound the scrape of their spoons. The night grew deeper. The cold settled in. A heavy, pressing weight. The fire was the only living thing in a world of white and black. Clara couldn't stand the silence. He had given her his answer, but it was not enough. I don't understand, she said, her voice small. You don't owe me anything. Daniel was staring into the flames, his plate empty beside him. He looked like a man carved from stone. No, he said, his voice flat. I don't. Why this choice, then? She pressed, her voice gentle. Why choose this? Why choose me? He picked up a stick, poked at the fire. The logs hissed, sending up a shower of sparks. He was quiet for so long. She thought he would not answer. I once worked a cattle drive, he said, his voice so low she had to lean forward to hear it. Down near the Cimarron, long time ago. I was younger. He paused, and she knew he was traveling back down that long, cold road. There was a man, Foley, big man, with a mean temper. He liked his whiskey, and he liked his fists. There was a kid with us, Mexican boy. Name was Pete, or Pablo. Something, maybe 14. Didn't speak much English. He was there to wrangle the horses. He stopped. The fire cracked. Go on, she whispered. Foley. He didn't like the kid. Said he was lazy. Said he was a thief. One night, we'd been paid. Foley got drunk. He accused the kid of stealing his watch. He didn't do it. I knew he didn't. I'd seen the watch in Foley's own saddlebag that morning. And Foley started in on him. With his belt, the buckle end. Daniel's hand, the one holding the stick, was clenched so tight it was trembling. The kid was screaming. No one did anything. They just watched. They said the kid had it coming, that he needed to learn his place. His voice was a monotone, a dead gray sound. I told him to stop. I told him to leave the boy be. Foley laughed. He called me. He said I was no better than the kid. And he hit the boy again. Hit him in the face. With the buckle. So I hit Foley. He was bigger than me, but he was drunk. We fought. It wasn't a clean fight. It was in the mud. By the fire. He was trying to kill me. I knew he was. He got his hands round my throat. Clara watched, horrified, as his hand went to his own neck. A brief, unconscious gesture. I couldn't breathe. I reached out. My hand hit something hard. It was the cook's shovel, the one he used for the coals. It was iron. He stopped. He didn't need to say the rest. I hit him, Daniel said, his voice hollow. I just hit him. Once, he went still. He didn't get up. The silence in the shelter was absolute. I didn't wait. The kid was gone, run off into the dark. The other men, They just stared. At me, at Foley. I took my horse. I took my pay. And I rode. I rode for 3 days. They'd have called it murder, he finished, finally looking at her. His gray eyes were empty. They wouldn't have cared about the boy. They wouldn't have cared that it was self-defense. A ranch hand kills another ranch hand over a Mexican boy. They'd have swung me from the nearest cottonwood. So I ran. And I ain't stopped running. Until now. He dropped the stick into the fire. It blazed up. He was a killer. He was an outcast. He was a man who had chosen to defend the defenseless. And it had cost him his whole life. And now, he was choosing her. Clara felt a profound, aching kinship with this broken man. He had showed her the deepest, darkest part of himself. Now, it was her turn. "They were right," she said, her voice shaking. "The town, the ranch hands." He looked at her, confused. "What?" "They were right. I am sick." "Clara." "No, let me," she said, cutting him off. "It's not just a cough. It's consumption. I know it is. My mother, she had it. It started just like this. The cough, the weakness, the fever at night." She pulled the blanket tighter, as if a shield. "I was a housemaid in Denver. I got cast out. I don't think I'm going to get better. Daniel." She said it, the truth, the death sentence. She had whispered it to herself in the dark, but she had never said it aloud. "I'm not strong," she said, tears welling, hot and fast. I'm just running out of time. So when you talk about choice, you're choosing a dying woman. I am a burden. I am a ghost. And I'm making you one, too." He looked at her, at the tears tracking through the grime on her cheeks, at the fever-bright shine in her eyes. He saw the truth. He saw the sickness. And he saw the woman beneath it. She saw the pity she had feared, but it was mixed with something else. Something deeper. She took a shaky breath. "You know what I am now. You know what's inside me. The sickness." She reached out, her hand trembling, and laid it on his arm. His muscles were iron. "Would you kiss me anyway?" It was the bravest thing she had ever said. It was not a request for love. It was a request for life. A request to be seen as a woman, not just an illness. Daniel did not move for a long time. He looked at her hand on his arm. He looked at her mouth, chapped and pale. He looked into her eyes, which were pleading with him to be human. He had run from a hanging. She was running from a grave. They were the same. He lifted his hand, the one that had held a shovel, and touched her face. His calloused, rough fingers were so gentle. She thought she would break. He traced the line of her jaw. "Clara," he whispered. It was the first time he had said her name. And then, slowly, deliberately, he leaned in. He kissed her. It was not a soft kiss. It was not gentle. It was slow. It was deep. It was tinged with the despair of his past and the hunger of his present. It tasted of coffee and wood smoke in the cold. Night air. It was a kiss of shared ruin. She gasped, her fingers clutching his shirt. He was real. He was warm. He was not afraid of her. He kissed her as if he was drinking, as if she was the first water he had found in a desert. He kissed her until the world disappeared, until there was nothing but the sound of their breathing and the roar of the fire in their blood. When he pulled back, they were both shaking. He looked at her, his eyes dark, and he knew, and she knew, that a line had been crossed. That night, their desire, a thing they had both buried under years of pain and survival, finally crested. The shelter was cold. The wind was rising again, singing its high, lonely song over the bluff, but their bodies were warm. He reached for her, and she did not pull away. It was desperate. It was beautiful. It was a clumsy fumbling of cold hands and numb fingers, a shedding of coats and blankets. It was shivering touches and soft, stifled gasps against the canvas. It was the trembling, terrifying discovery of being wanted. He was all hard lines and rough skin. She was all sharp bones and hidden softness. They came together not in grace, but in necessity. They were two broken, jagged pieces. But in the dark, on a bed of pine boughs, they fit. He moved over her, and she looked up at him, a shadow against the firelight. She was not afraid. For the first time in her life, she was not afraid. They found a rhythm that was all their own, a desperate, fierce claiming. This was not the town's business. This was not the rancher's land. This was a small, 3-foot space of canvas and wool that they had made their own. This was life, a hot, bright spark against the killing cold. Afterward, they lay tangled, their limbs heavy, their breathing slow. The world rushed back in, the sound of the wind, the hiss of the snow, the low embers of the fire. Daniel held her, his arm a heavy, warm bar across her waist. Clara was curled against his chest, her face buried in the rough wool of his shirt. She was warm. For the first time, she was truly, deeply warm. She lay still for a long time, listening to the steady beat of his heart under her ear. It was the most solid sound in the world. She lifted her head, just enough to speak. "You shouldn't have touched me," she whispered, her voice thick. He tensed, his arm tightening. She pressed her hand to his heart. "Now I'll never let you go." He said nothing. He just pulled the blanket higher, over both of them, and held on tighter. Outside their small, warm den, the snow began to fall again, thick and heavy, burying their tracks, burying the world. The world grew silent, and in that quiet, two broken things began to mend. The gray, frozen light of morning was merciless. It exposed everything, the intimacy of the night before, the fragile warmth they had built, felt impossible in the face of the new day. They woke slowly, stiff from the cold, still tangled in the single bedroll. For a moment, there was a profound, shared silence. They were shy. They were two strangers who had shared the most desperate, fundamental parts of themselves. Clara was the first to move, pulling away gently. Her cheeks were flushed, but it was not just the cold. Daniel sat up, his back cracking, and his first instinct was to look at the town. Nothing moved. The chimneys puffed their lazy, judgmental smoke into the still air. He was reaching for the coffee pot when the voice came, clear and hard in the cold. "Mr. Cole." Daniel was on his feet in a single, fluid motion. He didn't reach for his gun. He just stood, a solid, unmoving shadow at the mouth of the shelter. Clara huddled back, pulling the blanket up to her chin. Sheriff Brody stood 20 yards away. He was not alone. 2 men flanked him. Townsmen Clara recognized from the general store. They were not wearing badges. They were carrying rifles. "Sheriff," Daniel said. His voice was flat. "I'm here on behalf of the town council. Mr. Cole." Brody said. He did not sound sad today. He sounded weary and annoyed. He was a man who had been woken up too early for a job he did not want. His eyes flicked to Clara, to the single bedroll, and his mouth tightened. "They met last night," Brody continued, his voice loud enough to be an official proclamation. "After the complaints from Mr. Miller's men, from Mrs. Finch, from others. We ain't on their land," Daniel said. "You're on the edge of it, and you're an eyesore. You're an offense. Cole, that's what they're saying. The council has voted. You are to be out of the county by sundown tonight." Clara's breath hitched. Sundown. "And if I'm not?" Daniel asked, his voice quiet. "Then I am authorized to arrest you for vagrancy, for trespassing, and for public indecency." "Indecency," Daniel repeated. It was not a question. Brody's eyes were hard. "This is a God-fearing town. Son, we have wives. We have daughters. We don't appreciate this. He waved a gloved hand at their small, pathetic camp. "We ain't done nothing," Daniel said. "You are being—" One of the other men snapped. It was Hatcher, the man from the store. "You're being sick, and you're being a whore, and he's being a fool, and we're tired of it." "That's enough, Hatcher," Brody said, though not with any real force. He looked back at Daniel. "This ain't a suggestion. It's a formal order. Sundown." He paused, and his voice dropped. "And I'll give you some advice. Man to man, you'd best take it. The council making it official, that's one thing, but the men in this town, they're agitated. Hatcher here is right. They don't like what this looks like. If I don't run you out, there's a good chance a dozen other men will. And they won't be as polite as I'm being. They won't bring a warrant. They'll bring a rope. Do you understand me?" The threat hung in the air, cold and clear. A vigilante mob. Daniel looked at Hatcher. He looked at the other man. He looked at the sheriff. He gave a single, sharp nod. "Sundown," Brody said again. He turned, and the three men walked back toward the town. The silence they left behind was deafening. It was heavier, more final than the snow. Clara began to move. She didn't cry. She didn't wail. She moved with a frantic, desperate energy. She kicked aside the blanket, grabbing her few possessions, stuffing them into her carpet bag. "We have to go," she said, her voice a low, terrified rasp. "We have to go now. We can be halfway to the next county by sundown. They'll never find us. Daniel, why aren't you packing?" He was not packing. He was standing exactly where the sheriff had left him, staring at the town, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "Daniel, did you hear me?" she pleaded. She grabbed his arm. "They're coming back, not the sheriff. Those other men, they're going to hang you. You told me. You told me what happened. You can't be caught. Not here. Not for me. I won't be the reason." He looked down at her hand on his arm. Slowly, he unclenched his fist and covered her hand with his. "I'm done running," he said. "What?" she whispered. "I'm done," he said, his voice a low, rough rumble. "I ran from Foley. I ran from the Cimarron. I've been running ever since. Every time a man looks at me too hard, every time a sheriff asks my name, I run. I'm tired of it." "This isn't running," she cried. "This is surviving. They will kill you." "They ain't gonna give you justice," he said, turning to her. His gray eyes were on fire. "They looked at you, and they saw what they wanted to see. Sickness, sin. They didn't even look. They decided. They cast you out. They cast us out." He gestured to the town. "They didn't give that poor Mexican boy justice. They didn't give you justice. They damn sure ain't gonna give us justice." He took a step back, his face set in lines of hard, cold iron. "So we make our own." "What does that mean?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Daniel, what does that mean? You can't fight them. You have an axe. They have rifles and a rope." "It means I ain't running," he said. "Not from them. Not from this. Not from you." He turned away from her and went to his saddlebags. But he wasn't packing to leave. He pulled out the long, thick coil of rope he used for his bedroll. He picked up his axe. He walked past her, past the shelter, and into the sparse woods. Clara watched him go, her heart a cold stone of dread. He was going to die. He was choosing to die, right here, for her. He was not gone long. He returned, dragging 2 long, straight pine saplings. They were green, but they were strong. He laid them parallel on the snow. He began to strip the branches with his hatchet, his movements quick and economical. He was not building a barricade. He was building a sled, a travois. He found shorter, thicker pieces of wood and began to lash them between the 2 runners. Using the rope, he was carving notches, fitting them together. Clara watched him, her confusion warring with her terror. "If we have to move," he said, not looking up from his work. "We move, but we move when I say, Not when they say, "And you ain't walking." He was building a sled for her. He was not going to leave her. He was not going to make her walk. He was preparing to move her, to fight, to run, but on his own terms. A small, fierce spark ignited in Clara's chest. It was a fragile, angry little thing. He was choosing to stay. He was making his own justice. She looked at the town. They had cast her out. They had called her a whore. They had called her a curse. They were coming to kill the only man who had ever shown her a moment of true, selfless kindness. She went to her own carpet bag. She pulled out her small flannel housewife. She took the needle. She took the black thread. She looked around. She had nothing. She looked at her own clothes. The gray, thin wool of her dress was all she had. But inside her bag, the lining was torn. A dark, faded calico. She ripped a long, 6-inch strip from it. She looked at Daniel's saddlebag. There was an old, stained rag he used for cleaning his gun. It was a dirty white. She took it. She cut a strip. She looked for a third color. She had nothing. Finally, her eyes landed on the tattered remains of her own scarf, the one she had pressed to her mouth, the one that had frozen to her cheeks. It was a pale, washed-out blue. It was enough. She sat by the fire, her back to Daniel and his work, and she began to sew. Her hands were stiff, her fingers cracked and bleeding from the cold and the work, but her stitches were perfect, small, tight, and strong. She sewed the blue to the white. She sewed the white to the calico. It was a pathetic, ugly, beautiful thing. She found a straight, thin branch, broke it to a length of 3 feet, and tied her patchwork flag to the end. Daniel had just finished lashing the last crossbeam of the travois. He was testing its strength. Clara stood up. She walked past him. She walked to the very edge of their camp, where the path from the town met the creek bed. She stood there, a thin, frail figure in the vast, white snow, and with all her strength, she jammed the stick deep into the frozen bank. The flag fluttered, a tiny, desperate splash of color against the overwhelming gray and white. It was not a flag of surrender. It was a flag of existence. It said, "We are here. We will not be invisible. We will not disappear quietly." Daniel came and stood beside her. He looked at the flag. He looked at her. He reached out, not to her, but to the flag. He touched the blue fabric. "This was your scarf." "It's a flag now," she said. He nodded. A single, sharp motion. He put his hand on the small of her back. "Let's get some coffee." The afternoon was the longest of Clara's life. Every snap of a twig, every call of a bird made her jump, but the town did not come. The sun began its slow, merciless crawl toward the horizon. Sundown. They were eating a grim, silent meal of beans when a new figure appeared. This man was not the sheriff. He was not a ranch hand. He was on a mule, a thin man in a long black coat that was too thin for the weather. He wore a round hat, and his face was pinched and blue with cold. He stopped his mule a safe distance from the fire, and from Clara. "I am the Reverend Pike," he announced, his voice a high, reedy whine. "I am a traveler for the Lord. I was in the town, taking up a collection for the heathen, and I heard of your plight. I am here to minister to your souls." Daniel stood up, but he said nothing. He just watched. "You are living in sin," the preacher said, his eyes darting to the single bedroll, to the small shelter. "You are fornicating in the eyes of God and man. The town is right to cast you out. You have invited sickness and damnation upon yourselves." "Is that what you came to tell us?" Daniel asked, his voice low. "I came to offer you a chance at redemption," Pike said, warming to his sermon. "The woman, she is sick. Sickness is the wage of sin. It is a mark of the Lord's displeasure. But he is merciful. If you will repent, if you will renounce this filth, I will pray for your soul." He held out a hand, blue and raw. "Kneel, woman. Kneel in the snow and beg for his forgiveness, and I will intercede on your behalf." Clara looked at his hand. He was holding it out, but he was 10 feet away. "You want me to kneel," Clara said, her voice quiet. "Kneel and be saved." "And you'll, what, touch me? Lay your hands on me and heal me?" she asked. The Reverend Pike recoiled as if she had struck him. He pulled his hand back. I will not. The flesh is weak. I will not be contaminated. I will pray from here. That is enough." Clara stood up. The sickness, the fear, the anger, it all coalesced into a single, cold point of pure, clear rage. "You won't touch me," she said. It was a statement. "You're just like them. You're afraid. You're afraid of the sickness, and you're afraid of me. You talk about God, but you're a coward." "Blasphemy!" Pike shrieked. "Get out," she said. Her voice was not loud, but it cut through the cold air like a knife. "What?" "Get out. You keep your prayers. You keep your cowardly God. We don't want them here." The preacher gaped at her. He looked at Daniel, who had not moved, but who looked, in that moment, like he was carved from iron. You will burn," Pike sputtered. "You will die in your sin, and you will burn in hell for eternity." He yanked the reins of his mule, turning it so fast the animal slipped. He cursed, regained his balance, and kicked the poor beast back toward the town, still shouting about hellfire and damnation. Clara stood, watching him go, until he was just a black speck. Then, the strength that had held her up, the anger, it all evaporated. She began to cough. It started small, a dry hack, but it did not stop. It deepened. It became a storm, a terrible, racking, wet sound that ripped up from her lungs. Daniel was at her side in an instant, holding her. "Clara, breathe, easy, just breathe." She couldn't. She was drowning. She was suffocating. She tore her hand away from his grip, pressing it to her mouth, trying to hold the coughs in. It stopped. The fit passed, leaving her utterly, completely voided. She leaned against him, limp as a rag, gasping. It's all right," she panted. I'm all right." She let her hand fall from her mouth. She looked at her glove. On the gray, damp wool, there was a single, bright, terrible fleck of red. She stared at it. That was it. The proof. The final word. The mark of sin. Just as the preacher had said. This was her death warrant. Daniel saw it at the same moment. His face, which had been hard with anger, shattered into a mask of pure, raw fear. "No," Clara whispered. Her eyes were wide, fixed on the blood. No, please." The world went gray at the edges. The sound of the wind faded. The last thing she saw was the terror in Daniel's eyes. She collapsed, a dead weight, in his arms. "Clara!" He carried her. He did not take her to the cold pine boughs under the rock. He carried her to the fire, as close as he dared. He sat on the frozen ground, pulling her into his lap, wrapping both their blankets, his and hers, around her slight frame. He held her upright against his own chest. She was his, and he would not let her go. She was light as a sparrow, and she was burning. The fever, which had been a low ember, roared to life. She began to shiver, a violent, rattling tremor that shook both of them. "No," Daniel begged, his voice a rough, broken prayer. "No, you don't. You hang on. Clara, you hear me? You hang on. You don't let them win. You don't let this win. Stay with me. Stay with me." The sun touched the horizon. Sundown. The vigilantes did not come. The town, perhaps, was waiting for the cold and the sickness to do their work for them. The night deepened. The temperature plummeted. It was the coldest night yet, a profound, deadly cold that sucked the breath from the lungs. Daniel did not move. He sat, holding her, his own body a shield against the dark. He fed the fire, stick by stick, with his free hand, never letting her go. She began to dream. She moaned, her head thrashing against his chest. "No, locked in." "It's all right," he murmured, his voice a low vibration against her ear. "You ain't locked in. I'm right here. I got you." He had to keep her tethered. He had to keep her voice in the world. So he started to talk. I once saw a river," he whispered, his voice rough. "In Oregon. It was so blue. Clara, it hurt to look at, bluer than the sky. And cold, so cold. It felt like fire when you touched it. I'm going to take you there. We'll see that river." She cried out, a small, pained sound. "Mama, the song, please." "Shh, shh," he soothed, rocking her. He didn't know any songs. "It's all right. You're safe." Her dreams were a storm. She smelled potatoes and damp earth. She heard a bar drop. Click. She was in the dark, alone, her mother's face, pale and terrified. "Don't make a sound. Don't you dare." Then the shouting, the boots, the crashing glass. She was in the cellar, alone in the dark. And they were coming, and she couldn't breathe. "I'm here." Daniel's voice cut through the dark. "You ain't alone. I'm right here. Listen to me. Just listen to my voice." He told her about the sky. "There's stars out here," he whispered, holding her tight, his chin resting on the top of her head. "In Texas, on the plains, there's no mountains. The sky, it goes on forever. More stars than you can count, more stars than black. They fall, sometimes, a streak of fire, like God striking a match. You'd like it. You'd like the stars." He talked all night. He gave her his life, piece by piece. He told her about a cattle drive in a thunderstorm, the air tasting like metal. He told her about the smell of sagebrush after a rain. He told her about his horse, and how it was the only friend he'd had for 3 years. He wove a rope of words, of memories, and he held her with it, refusing to let her slip into the dark. The gray light of dawn found them just like that. Daniel, his back and arms a solid wall of agony, his face cracked with fatigue, his beard and hat thick with frost. He was a man made of ice, except for the small, warm core where he held her. The fire was dead. Clara's eyes fluttered open. The fever had broken. She was weak, she was exhausted, but she was lucid. She was in his arms. She was wrapped in every blanket they owned. He was shaking from the cold, but he had not let her go. She saw the frost on his shoulders. She felt the bitter, open-air cold around them, and she felt the deep, steady warmth of his chest beneath her cheek. He had kept her out of the dark. She was disoriented. She was not under the rock. She looked up. There was no roof, just the pale, endless, gray sky. He had held her, exposed to the elements, all night, to keep her by the fire. She lifted a hand, so weak she could barely move it, and touched his icy duster. "Did you really stay outside all night?" she whispered, her voice a dry crackle. He had been so still. He looked startled. He looked down. His gray eyes were bloodshot, exhausted, but they were so clear. He had faced down the town. He had faced down the preacher. He had faced down her death. And he was still here. He managed a small, cracked smile. His voice was a raw, aching rasp. "I told you," he said. "I'm not going anywhere." The fever did not return. The racking cough that had torn her apart receded, leaving behind a silence that was almost as frightening. Clara slept, a deep, exhaustive sleep that lasted a day and a night, with Daniel sitting like a stone guardian, watching her breathe. When she finally woke, the weakness was profound. It was a hollowness in her bones, but the fire was gone. "Water," she whispered. He was there, instantly, holding the canteen to her lips. His hand, the one that held the cup, was shaking slightly from his long, cold vigil. "Easy," he said. She drank. The cold water was a shock. She looked at him. His face was gray with fatigue, his beard thick with frost, his eyes bloodshot. "You're a fool, Daniel Cole," she whispered, her voice a dry rasp. "Drink," he said, ignoring her. Their survival, it seemed, had shamed the town. The smoke from their fire, the little patched flag, the refusal to die. It was an offense, and now it was an embarrassment. On the third day after the fever, a man rode out. Not the sheriff, not Hatcher. He was a thin man on a tired-looking horse. He stopped a full 30 yards from their camp, well outside the range of a cough. "Hello, the camp," he called. Daniel stepped out from the shelter, his axe in his hand. "I'm Dr. Elias," the man called. He looked nervous. The town council, that is Mrs. Finch and others, they asked me to check on the situation." "We're fine," Daniel said, his voice flat. "Yes, well, the woman, she's ill. I have some laudanum for the cough and a tincture for the fever, if it returns." He was pulling small, dark bottles from his bag. He set them on a clean patch of snow. "You ain't coming closer?" Daniel asked. "No, The doctor looked down. "I cannot. Doctor's orders. For myself. But I was told to say she should be drinking broth. Hot broth. If you can." He was a coward. He was a messenger for cowards. "We have no money," Daniel said. It's been seen to," the doctor said, his face flushing red. "Paid for by the ladies' auxiliary. They do not want a death on their conscience. Not before Christmas." He was already backing his horse away. "Leave the bottles in the snow when you're done. I'll fetch them. Later." He turned and rode away, quickly. Daniel walked over and picked up the bottles. He came back to the shelter and handed one to Clara. He looked at the brown liquid, then at the town. "They're afraid we'll haunt them," he said. "They should be," Clara whispered. The laudanum helped. It quieted the remaining ache in her chest and let her sleep. Daniel hunted. He set snares, small, desperate traps for rabbits. He came back with one, thin and gray. He boiled it in the pot with snow, making the broth the doctor had ordered. It was hot and it was salty, and it was the first real food that had stayed in her stomach. Strength began to seep back, not in a flood, but in small, careful drops. The next day, she was sitting up, mending Daniel's shirt, when she saw the movement. Daniel was gone, checking his snares. Clara was alone. 2 children, a boy and a girl, no older than 8. They were bundled in rough wool, their faces red from the cold. They crept down the path from the town, looking over their shoulders. They stopped at the flag. The little girl, the braver one, darted forward. She laid something at the base of the flagstick. Then the boy did the same. They looked at the shelter, their eyes wide with fear and curiosity. Clara did not move. They turned and ran, scrambling back up the hill as if they'd touched something haunted. When Daniel returned, Clara told him. He walked over to the flag. He came back, his hands full. In one hand, he held 2 stale, hard biscuits, the kind that would be sold for a penny at the general store. In the other, he held a piece of folded foolscap. He opened it. It was a child's drawing, a stick figure of a man, a stick figure of a woman. They were standing next to a triangle with the smoke coming out of it. Their house, underneath in the ground, a lumpy gray shape. "That's us," Clara whispered, looking at the drawing. "But what's that, at the bottom?" Daniel turned the drawing over. He looked at the crude figures. "That," he said, his voice rough, "is a potato." They were gifts, biscuits and a drawing of a potato. The town's shame and the children's kindness. It was a fragile piece, and it was shattered 3 days later. A new stagecoach arrived. Not the battered, mud-caked wagon that served Gravel Ridge. This was a private coach, painted a deep, glossy black, with yellow wheels. It spoke of money. It spoke of the East. Daniel had gone into town. It was a risk, but they were out of coffee, and he needed salt. He was gone, and Clara was alone. When the man walked down the hill, she smelled him before she saw him. Bay rum, expensive cigars. Her head snapped up. She had been stirring the fire, her face hidden in her scarf. She froze. "Good God," the voice said. She stood, her legs weak. Mr. Harrison looked just the same, perhaps a little thicker in the middle, his face a little redder from the cold and the whiskey. He was wearing a fine, fur-lined coat. He was not looking at her with pity. He was looking at her as if she were a piece of trash he'd found on his boot. "Clara," he said. He did not sound surprised. He sounded annoyed. "I should have known. I heard there was a situation by the creek. I did not imagine it was you." "Hey, Mr. Harrison," she said. Her voice was a dead thing. "So this is what you've become," he said, his eyes sweeping over the crude shelter, the smoking fire, the tattered blankets. His gaze lingered on the single bedroll. "Living in the dirt with who? Some half-wild trapper?" "Go away," she said. "Go away," he laughed, a short, booming sound that was obscene in the quiet. "My dear girl, I am not the one who should go away. I am a guest at the hotel. My wife is with me. We are on our way to Seattle, and I find you a complication." He took a step closer. She took a step back. "You look terrible," he said, as if noticing her hollow cheeks for the first time. "That cough, is it?" He actually looked concerned, but not for her, for himself. "What do you want?" she demanded. His face hardened. The brief, false concern vanished. "I want you to know your place. Clara, you were a liar in Denver, and you are this now. My wife, she was distressed by your accusations. She is a fragile woman. If she were to see you, to think that unpleasantness had followed us." "I accused you of nothing," Clara said, her voice shaking with a sudden, cold fury. "I said nothing. You said nothing," he agreed, smoothing his gloves. "And in your silence, you condemned me. You let my wife believe it was a disaster. I am a forgiving man. Clara, I did not have you arrested for theft. Though I could have, I let you disappear." He looked at her, his eyes cold. "I suggest you do so again. I will be in this town for 2 days. When I leave, I expect you and your associate to be gone. It would be better for everyone." He turned, not waiting for a reply, and walked back up the hill. A clean, powerful man, disgusted by the filth he had stumbled upon. Clara sank to the ground. The past had not just followed her, it had hunted her down. When Daniel returned, he didn't have to ask. Her face, white and still, told him everything. He dropped the small sack of supplies. "Who was he?" he said. She told him. She told him everything. The study, the wife, the lie. Daniel's face, as he listened, did not change. It just hardened. It became a mask of gray stone. He was still staring into the fire when the sheriff arrived. This time, Brody did not come alone. He had Hatcher and Miller's ranch hands, and 2 other men Clara didn't recognize. They were a posse. They were a mob. "Cole!" Brody shouted. He was on horseback, as were the others. They looked down at them, in their small, pathetic camp. "It's over." "What is?" Daniel asked, not moving. "We know the truth," Hatcher spat, his rifle held across his lap. We got a respectable man in town. A Mr. Harrison from Denver. He knows this woman. He told us all about you, girly," another man sneered. "A drunk, a liar, a common whore. Run out of Denver for stealing." Clara flinched as if he had struck her. "The town council has met Cole," Brody said, his voice cold and official. "Mr. Harrison's testimony has clarified the situation. You are no longer harboring a sick woman. You are harboring a wanted criminal. And you're an accomplice." "She ain't no criminal," Daniel said. "That ain't for you to say," Brody snapped. "That's for a judge, and that's where you're going. Both of you. You're under arrest for vagrancy, public lewdness, and aiding a fugitive." "You're not taking her," Daniel said. He picked up his axe. The men laughed. Hatcher raised his rifle. "Put the axe down, you fool! You're done!" "Sheriff," Daniel said. His eyes locked on Brody. "You do this. You're making a mistake." "The only mistake I made was not running you off the first night," Brody said. He pulled his own pistol. "Drop the axe. Cole, last time I'm gonna say it." Daniel looked at the rifles. He looked at Clara, who was shaking, her hand over her mouth. He looked at the axe. Slowly, he let it fall into the snow. "Good," Brody said. "Now, Hatcher, you stay here. Keep an eye on him. The rest of you, with me. I gotta get the wagon. And irons." The sheriff and half the men rode off. Hatcher and 2 others remained, their rifles trained on the camp. "Don't you move, neither of you," Hatcher said. "Don't even breathe wrong." Night fell. The sheriff did not come back. The wagon did not come. Hatcher and the other men were cold. They were angry. They were drinking from a flask. "This is stupid," one of them muttered. "Why are we waiting? Let's just end it." "Brody wants him in irons," Hatcher said. But he was looking at Clara. He was looking at their shelter. "It's a sickness," the other man said, his voice ugly. "It's a plague. Fire. Fire cleans plague." Clara saw Hatcher's eyes light up. "Daniel," she whispered. "Get your bag," Hatcher said to his friends. "The one with the kerosene, for the lantern." "No," Daniel said, stepping in front of Clara. "You ain't in a position to say no, Cole." Hatcher sneered. "We're just cleaning up the town. Sheriff will thank us." The other man came back. He wasn't subtle. He unstopped the tin and began splashing the dark, pungent liquid on the canvas of their shelter. "No!" Clara screamed. "Get back!" Hatcher yelled, leveling his rifle at Daniel. The man with the tin pulled a match. He struck it. "A fire," he giggled, his voice drunk. "A nice, warm fire for the whores." He tossed the match. The canvas, soaked in oil and dry as tinder, did not catch. It exploded. A wall of flame erupted. A furious orange whoosh that drove them all back. The pine boughs beneath it, dry from the fire, caught instantly. Their home, their shelter, their world, became a roaring inferno in 2 seconds. Daniel did not hesitate. He grabbed Clara, throwing her sideways, out of the shelter, pushing her face into the snow. "Stay down!" he roared. Hatcher and his men were laughing, whooping as the flames shot 20 feet into the air. Daniel saw it. The blankets. They're only blankets. The bedroll. It was on fire. He lunged. He grabbed the smoldering wool, trying to beat the flames out, trying to save the one thing that could keep them alive. A piece of the burning canvas, heavy and black, fell from the rock face. It landed square on his arm. He roared, a sound of pure agony, and ripped the flaming thing off him. But the damage was done. His duster was on fire. He fell, rolling in the snow, beating at his own arm. The men just watched him, their laughter dying. "My God, Hatcher," one of them whispered. "His arm. He deserved it," Hatcher said, but his voice was uncertain. Daniel got to his knees. His left arm was a ruin. The duster was gone, burned away. The shirt beneath it black and smoking. He looked at the men. He said nothing. His face was a mask of such cold, profound, murderous rage that Hatcher took a step back. We was just, we're going to get the sheriff, Hatcher stammered. They fled. They ran, scrambling up the hill, leaving the two of them in the snow, lit only by the dying, hissing flames of their destroyed home. The flag, the little patched flag, was gone, burned to ash. Clara crawled to him. He was on his knees, panting, cradling his left arm. She could smell it. The burned cloth, the burned flesh. She began to sob. It was not a small, quiet sound. It was a raw, tearing wail of absolute despair. She had nothing. They had nothing. And now, he was crippled. "Stop!" she wept, pounding the frozen ground with her fist. "Just stop. It's too much." "Clara," he gritted out, his voice tight with pain. "No, let me die," she screamed at him. "Do you hear me? Just let me lie here and freeze. It's me. I'm the one they want. I'm the curse. I brought him here. I brought all of this. Please, Daniel, just let me go." She was sobbing, begging him to release her, to let the world finally win. He reached out with his good hand, his right hand, and grabbed the front of her coat. He hauled her to him, his face inches from hers. His eyes were wild, blazing with pain and a terrifying, protective fury. "You listen to me," he snarled, his voice a low, painful growl. "You don't get to die. You don't get to quit. He doesn't get to win. That man in the hotel, they don't get to win. No one else gets to take you." He shook her, his grip iron. "You are not a curse. You are. He looked at her, at the tears, at the soot, at the terror, and his voice, for a moment, broke. "You're mine, if you'll have me." It was not a question. It was a statement, a fact. He was claiming her. From the town, from her past, from death itself. Clara stared at him, at this burned, broken, defiant man. He was the only thing in her life that had not run. He was the only thing that had stood for her. Her sobs quieted. She lifted her hand, her fingers trembling, and touched his face, his jaw, the one that was set against the world. "Then take me," she whispered, her voice raw. "Before it's too late, make me yours. Daniel, make me yours so they can't." It was not a surrender. It was an oath. He kissed her. It was not the slow, despairing kiss from before. It was a brutal, claiming, fiery kiss. It tasted of smoke and ash and blood. He kissed her with all the pain in his arm, with all the rage in his heart. It was a desperate, angry, beautiful thing. She kissed him back, clutching his good arm, pulling him down into the snow, into the scorched, wet ruin of their camp. This was not love-making. This was a claiming. This was a vow. It was fiery, and it was emotional, and it was desperate. It was two people, pushed to the absolute edge, choosing to claim life, to claim each other, in a world that was trying to deny them both. They moved in the snow, under the freezing, uncaring stars. Their clothes were torn and scorched. The cold air bit at their skin, but they did not feel it. They were a single, hot point of life in the frozen dark. He was in her, and she was holding him. And for these few, desperate moments, the town did not exist. Mr. Harrison did not exist. The fire did not exist. There was only this. Afterward, they lay in the snow, in the one remaining, half-burned blanket. Clara was shivering, pressed against his good side. He was breathing hard, his burned arm held stiffly away from them. "We can't stay here," she whispered. "We'll freeze." "No," he said. His voice was different. The anger was gone. The desperation was gone. All that was left was a cold, flat calm. "We won't freeze." He sat up, his movements stiff. He looked at his arm. He looked at the smoking ruin of their home. He looked at the town, at the few, smug lights. He stood up. "Daniel, what are you doing?" He didn't answer. He went to his saddle, which had been thrown clear. He pulled out his rope. He walked to his horse. "Stay here," he said. "Don't move." "Where are you going?" she cried. He swung into the saddle, his movements stiff with pain. He looked down at her. "I'm done running," he said, "and I'm done hiding. They want justice? I'm going to give it to 'em." He turned the horse and rode, not away from the town, but straight toward it. He did not go to the sheriff's office. He did not go to the hotel. He went to the Gilded Cage, the saloon and brothel that had turned Clara away. The lights were on. The piano was tinny in the cold air. He didn't tie his horse. He just dropped the reins. He walked in, his burned arm held at his side, his face a mask of black soot and righteous fury. The saloon went silent. He saw him, Mr. Harrison. He was at a back table, drunk, a half-empty bottle of whiskey in front of him, a saloon girl on his lap. He was boasting, laughing about how he'd cleared the trash out of Gravel Ridge. Harrison looked up and saw Daniel. His face went white. Daniel did not say a word. He crossed the room. He grabbed Harrison by the front of his expensive, fur-lined coat with his good hand. He hit him once, a hard, solid crack of bone on bone. Harrison slumped, unconscious. The saloon girl screamed. The bartender reached for a shotgun. "Don't," Daniel said. His voice was a low growl. He pulled his rope. He tied Harrison's hands. He did it all with one arm. He was a specter of vengeance. He dragged the unconscious man out the door, into the street. He looped the rope around the pommel of his saddle. He got on his horse. And he rode. He rode into the main street of Gravel Ridge just as the first gray light of dawn was breaking the horizon. He dragged Harrison through the frozen mud, past the general store, past the hotel. He rode to the center of town, to the exact spot where Clara had been dumped by the stagecoach. He stopped. Mr. Slocum was just opening his store. Mrs. Finch was in her window, pulling back the curtain. Sheriff Brody, who had spent the night sleeping warm in his bed, was coming out of the diner with a cup of coffee. They all froze. Daniel cut the rope. Harrison fell, moaning, into the icy, muddy rut. He was covered in filth. Daniel Cole, his arm burned, his face black, sat on his horse and looked at the gathering crowd. Mrs. Harrison, her face a mask of confusion, had come out onto the hotel porch. "You wanted justice," Daniel shouted, his voice echoing in the cold, silent street. "You wanted the truth. There he is." He pointed at Harrison, who was trying to sit up, groaning. "This is your respectable man. This is the man you believed. I found him at the Gilded Cage, drunk, with his hands on a whore, bragging about how he'd run Clara off." He looked at Mrs. Harrison. "Ma'am, I'm sorry, but your husband is a liar, and he's a coward." He looked at Sheriff Brody. "You listened to him. You believed him. You let your men burn us out." He pointed to the mud. "This is your truth, Gravel Ridge, not mine." A stunned, absolute silence fell over the street. No one moved. No one spoke. The sheriff just stared, his coffee cup halfway to his mouth. Mrs. Harrison made a small, sick sound. No one stopped Daniel. No one even tried. Sheriff Brody's hand, the one holding the coffee cup, was frozen in the air. The cup was steaming. The steam rose, thinned, and vanished in the sharp, gray morning. The street was so quiet. The only sound was the drip of dirty water from the awning of the general store and the low, wet groans of Mr. Harrison, trying to push himself out of the mud. Daniel Cole sat on his horse, a specter. He was soot-stained, one arm held stiff and useless, his face a mask of iron. He had not drawn a weapon. He had not raised his voice. He had simply delivered the truth, like a parcel, and dropped it in the center of their town. Mrs. Harrison, on the hotel porch, made a sound. It was not a scream. It was a small, high-pitched, tearing sound, like wet silk ripping. She put one white, gloved hand over her mouth, and with the other, she turned, fumbled for the door, and disappeared inside. Harrison was on his hands and knees now. "Abigail!" he cried, his voice a drunken, pathetic wail. "Abigail, it's a lie. He's a madman. He hit me." No one moved to help him. Sheriff Brody lowered his arm. He looked at the man in the mud. He looked at the soiled, expensive coat. He looked at Daniel, on the horse. He looked at the faces in the windows. He saw Mrs. Finch, her arms crossed, watching. He saw Slocum, his spectacles fogged, standing in his own doorway. He saw Hatcher, who had come running, his rifle in his hand, but who now stood frozen, watching the sheriff, waiting for the order. Brody took a long, slow breath. The steam from his coffee was gone. It was cold. He was the law. He had a man, beaten and tied, in his street. He had an attacker, armed with nothing but righteousness, sitting on a horse, and he had a town that was, for the first time, utterly silent, waiting to see which way the wind would blow. He looked at Harrison. He looked at Daniel. He turned his back. He walked, his steps heavy, to the hitching post in front of his office, and poured the last of his cold coffee into the dirt. He did not look back. He did not say a word. He just looked away. It was the most powerful thing he could have done. It was an abdication. It was a judgment. Hatcher lowered his rifle. Slocum took off his spectacles and began to polish them. His hands shaking, Mrs. Finch just snorted. A single, sharp, disgusted sound, and turned away from her window. The town had shifted. The truth, ugly and raw, had been seen, and in that moment, the town of Gravel Ridge felt a new, unfamiliar emotion. It was not kindness. It was not pity. It was shame, and a cold, grudging respect for the man on the horse, and with it, a new, sharp fear. Daniel Cole did not move. He waited. He watched the sheriff go. He watched Hatcher, who looked at the ground, then at his own feet, and then slunk away, back toward the saloon, his rifle held low. Harrison, finally, staggered to his feet. He was a ruin. His face was bleeding. His coat was a mockery. His honor was a rag in the mud. He looked at Daniel, his eyes full of a wet, terrified hate. "You will hang," he whispered. "Get," Daniel said. His voice was not loud. It was a low, guttural command. Harrison stumbled, tried to find his dignity, and found only his fear. He scrambled, half running, half walking, toward the hotel. He yanked the door open and disappeared, just as his wife had done. Daniel sat on his horse, alone in the street. He had won, and he was still an outcast. He turned his horse, slowly, and rode back down the hill, toward the smoking, stinking ruin of his camp. He found Clara where he had left her, huddled in the one scorched blanket. She was staring at him, her eyes wide, as if he were a ghost. He dismounted, his body screaming in protest. His arm was a single, long bolt of fire. "Daniel," she whispered. He didn't have an answer. He sat heavily, in the snow, his back to the town. He had won the battle. But the war was the cold. The war was his arm. The war was the fact that they had, once again, nothing. They sat like that for an hour. Two people in a black, wet circle of ash. Then a new shadow fell over them. Clara looked up, her hand flying to her mouth. Daniel tried to stand, but his legs were stiff. It was a woman. She was tall, thin, and plain, with her hair pulled back in a severe bun. She wore spectacles and a wool coat that looked clean but very, very old. It was Miss Abigail, the town school teacher. She was the one woman in town who had never sneered, never whispered. She had simply watched. She was carrying a basket. She did not stop 10 yards away. She walked right up to their camp, her thin lips set in a line of firm disapproval. She looked at the burned canvas. She looked at Daniel's arm. She looked at Clara. "This," Miss Abigail said, her voice crisp and clear as the air, "is an unacceptable situation." Daniel just stared at her. "You," she said, pointing a gloved finger at Daniel. "You are burned. You will have the putrefaction set in if you do not clean that." She turned to Clara. "And you will die of lung fever if you sit in that snow for one more night." She set the basket down. "The town," she said, as if the word tasted bad, "is a collection of fools and cowards." She looked back at Daniel. "What you did was not Christian, but it was, I suspect, necessary." She took a deep breath. "I have no power in this town. Mr. Cole, I'm just the schoolmarm, but I have a key. There is a cabin up by the canyon. It was for the miners. Years ago, no one has lived in it for 3 winters. It is a wreck. The roof leaks. The window is broken, but it has a stove, and it has walls." She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a large, rusted iron key. She held it out to Daniel. He looked at the key. He looked at her. He did not move his good arm. "Take it," she said, her voice sharp. "It is not charity. It is practicality. I cannot have this on my conscience." Slowly, Daniel reached out with his good hand and took the key. "In the basket," she said, "there is a bar of lye soap. There is carbolic. Clean that arm. There is also broth." She looked away, toward the mountains. "That is all." She turned, her black coat snapping, and walked back up the hill. Daniel looked at the key in his palm. It was cold, and it was heavy. It was a start. They moved that day. It was a slow, agonizing procession. Daniel, holding his burned arm, loaded Clara onto his horse. He put their few, ruined possessions, the pot, the axe, the scorched blanket, onto the travois he had built. He walked, leading the horse, up the canyon path. The cabin was, as Miss Abigail had promised, a wreck. It was a one-room shell of gray, weathered wood. The wind whistled through the gaps in the chinking. The window was a single, gaping hole, boarded over with a few rotting planks. But it had a door, it had a floor, and in the corner, covered in rust and mouse drollings, was a small, cast-iron stove. It was a palace. They spent the first day making it livable. Clara, though weak, stuffed the gaps in the walls with moss and dried grass. Daniel, his face tight with pain, used his good arm and his hatchet to cut down the boards on the window. Letting in the gray, flat light, he tacked their one remaining, scorched blanket over the hole. It would have to do. That night, Clara cleaned his arm. It was a nightmare. The canvas had melted into the skin. He sat on the floor, his back to the wall, his jaw clenched as she, with trembling hands, used the last of their coffee, boiled, to wash the wound. He did not make a sound, but she felt the shiver of his agony. She wrapped it in clean rags she tore from her own petticoat. Winter held on, but in the cabin, they held on too. Daniel's arm healed, but it healed badly. It would never be straight again. The skin was a mass of tight, red, puckered scars. He had lost strength in the hand, but he could use it. He found odd jobs. He could not hire on as a ranch hand, not with one good arm, but he could chop wood. He chopped wood for Mrs. Finch, who paid him in coin, and never looked him in the eye. He mended a fence for Slocum, who paid him in a sack of beans and a side of salt pork, and muttered. Town's quiet, now. Since that, Harrison left. Clara, too, began to work. Her strength was returning. The cough was still there, a shadow in her chest. But it was a shadow. The cabin, the food, the rest. It was working a slow, quiet miracle. She took her needle and thread, and she mended. She mended shirts for the miners who passed through. She mended the school teacher's one good dress. She even, in a moment of sharp irony, mended a dozen of the gilded cage's torn saloon curtains. The work delivered and picked up by a child, so that no one's reputation would be stained. They were pariahs, but they were their pariahs. They were the people of the canyon. They existed. And then, one day, it was spring. It did not happen all at once. It was not a grand announcement. It was just a change. The snow, which had been their white, frozen prison, began to recede. The solid, iron-hard ground softened to mud. The creek, which had been a ribbon of ice, began to talk. It was a low, rushing sound of moving water. With the melt, Clara's health returned in earnest. The warmth seeped into her bones. She ate the rabbit from Daniel's snares, and the broth, and the beans, and she felt herself filling. The hollow, terrible weakness began to recede. And as she healed, he healed. The nightmares that had plagued him, the ones that had him waking in a cold sweat, his hand reaching for a shovel that wasn't there, they began to fade. He stopped waking at every sound. He stopped staring at the door. He was no longer running. He was, for the first time in his adult life. Still, he was home. One afternoon, late in April, the air was so warm they had the door of the cabin propped open. Daniel was outside, trying to fix a broken hinge on a shutter, his scarred, stiff fingers fumbling with the small, cold pieces of metal. He dropped the pin for the third time. It vanished in the mud. He swore, a low, vicious curse, and kicked the wall, his good hand clenched in frustration. And inside the cabin, Clara laughed. It was not a cough. It was not a nervous titter. It was a real, full, deep, honest laugh, a sound of pure, unadulterated amusement at his frustration. Daniel froze. He had never heard that sound. He had heard her cry. He had heard her cough. He had heard her whisper in fear and in passion. He had never heard her laugh. He turned, slowly, and looked at her. She was standing in the doorway, her hand over her mouth, but her eyes were shining, dancing with a light he had never seen. He stared at her. His heart, which he had thought was a hard, cold stone, seemed to crack. It ached. "What?" she said, the laugh still in her voice. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "No," he said, his voice rough. I'm listening to the opposite." He forgot the hinge. He went to her, took her by the hand, and pulled her out into the weak, spring sunlight. A week later, the creek was running high, but the water was clear, melted from the high country snow. It was no longer a threat. It was a promise. "It's time," she said. He knew what she meant. They were grimy. They had been cleaning with snow and a kettle for months. They went down to the creek, to a small, sheltered bend he knew, hidden by willows that were just beginning to bud. It was still cold, but the sun was hot. It was awkward. They were a man and a woman, scarred and broken. They undressed, their backs to each other, shy as children. He saw her, truly, for the first time in the full light of day. She was so thin. Her ribs were a delicate, fine-spun cage. Her skin was pale, marked by the memory of her sickness. But she was not a ghost. She was solid. She was real. He waded in first, the water so cold it stole his breath. He turned to her. She waded in. Her hands crossed over her chest, and she gasped as the cold hit her. She came to him, and he took her hand. He had the bar of lye soap. He washed her hair, his good hand clumsy, his scarred hand useless. He rubbed the soap, working it into a lather, and rinsed it with the icy water. She leaned into him, her back to his chest. "Now you," she said. She took the soap, and she washed his back. Her fingers were light. They traced the old scars, the whip-like marks from a life he hadn't told her about. And then, her fingers moved to his left arm. She paused. "Does it hurt?" she whispered. "No," he lied. "It's just stiff." She took his hand, the scarred one, the one with the tight, pulled skin, and she brought it to her lips. She kissed the ruined knuckles. He looked down at the top of her head, at her wet, dark hair. She turned in his arms, wrapping herself around him, her wet, cold skin against his. Her hair, long and dark, trailed over his chest. She pressed her face into the space between his neck and shoulder. "You're the first place I've ever wanted to stay," she whispered. He just held her, his arms locked around her, as the cold, clean water of the spring rushed around their legs, washing everything away. They talked of marriage. It was Daniel who brought it up. One night, sitting by the stove, he was a man who believed in things being right. "We should find that preacher," he said. The one who's not Pike, the one that travels." "Why?" she asked. She was mending one of his shirts, the light from the kerosene lamp making her face soft. "Because it's the right thing," he said, fumbling. "To make it real." She put the shirt down. She came and sat on the floor by his chair, leaning her head against his knee. "Daniel," she said, her voice quiet. "This is real." She touched the wall. "This cabin is real. That scar on your arm is real." She looked up at him. "A preacher, a piece of paper, that's their way. That's the town's way. The law, the church. What did they ever do for us? They tried to kill us." He said nothing. He knew she was right. "I don't want a preacher," she said. She took his good hand. "I don't want a church. I want to stand right here on this porch, under that open sky. And I want to make a promise. To you. Not to God. Not to the town. Just to you." He looked at her, at the fierce, fragile strength in her face, and he understood. "All right," he said. "Under the sky." Their last test came, as it had to. From the town, Daniel was in the general store. He was buying flour. He had $5 in his pocket, hard-earned. The door opened. Hatcher came in, followed by two of Miller's ranch hands. They were drunk. It was midday. Hatcher saw Daniel. He smiled, a slow, ugly smile. "Well, well," Hatcher drawled. "Look who it is, the king of the canyon. Come to buy flour for his queen." Daniel just nodded at Slocum. "Just the flour, Mr. Slocum." "In a hurry. Coal?" Hatcher said, stepping in front of him. "I'm talking to you and your consumptive whore. You think you're better than us, don't you? Hiding up there." Daniel looked at Hatcher. His gray eyes were flat. "I ain't got business with you. Hatcher, step aside." "Or what?" Hatcher sneered. "You'll hit me with your one good arm. You'll drag me out of a saloon." He was playing to his friends. "I'm just asking you to step aside." Daniel said. "I don't think I will," Hatcher said. He put his hand on Daniel's chest and shoved. Daniel stumbled back, his boots slipping on the wooden floor. He did not raise his hand. He just stood, his good hand clenched, his scarred hand held at his side. Hatcher laughed and went to shove him again. "That's enough." The voice was not Daniel's. It was Slocum's. The thin proprietor had come from around the counter. He was holding a shotgun, and it was aimed steady at Hatcher's gut. "He's buying flour. Hatcher," Slocum said, his voice quiet, but shaking with a high, thin rage. "And he's paying cash, which is more than I can say for you, this past month. Now, you either buy something, or you get out." Hatcher stared at the shotgun. You're taking his side? Slocum, he's..." The door of the hotel across the street opened. Mrs. Finch stood on the porch, a broom in her hand. "Hatcher," she yelled, her voice a shrill command. "You're drunk, and you're disturbing the peace. Sheriff Brody ain't gonna like it. Now, you get on." Hatcher looked at Slocum. He looked at Mrs. Finch. He looked at Daniel, who had not moved, who was just watching. The town had not joined him. The town had turned on Hatcher. Hatcher's face went red. He looked at his friends, who were suddenly very interested in a barrel of pickles. Defeated, he spat on the floor. This ain't over," he snarled. "It is," Slocum said. "Get out." Hatcher left. Daniel nodded once to Slocum. Slocum nodded back, lowered the shotgun, and went back to weighing the flour. The town had, in its own grudging, complicated way, finally let them in. A week later, Clara walked to the church. It was Sunday. The town was inside, listening to the traveling preacher. She did not go in. She had no prayers. She had only memory. She carried a small basket she had woven from willow branches. She set it on the bottom step. Inside was a small, clean-mended blanket. There was a heel of bread. There was a small tin of jerky that Daniel had made. And there was a single, small, blue flower she had picked from the canyon wall. It was for the next one, the next soul, the next person who would be cast out. She turned and walked away, back to the cabin, and did not look back. That night, they lay on the porch. The cabin was behind them. The vast, dark spread of the canyon was in front. Above them, the sky was a black velvet ocean, so thick with stars it looked as if it had been spilled. They were lying on a blanket, their hands linked. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "Just stars," he said. She was quiet for a long time. She was thinking about Denver, about the cold, about the blood on her glove, about the fire. "Daniel," she said. My cough, it's better, but it's not gone. I know it might not stay gone." He squeezed her hand. "Don't." "No," she said. I'm not afraid of it, not anymore. I want you to know." She turned her head on the blanket, looking at his profile in the starlight. "Even if I die young," she whispered, her voice thick. "Even if I only have this one spring, I would choose this. I would choose this life with you 100 times. He was quiet. He looked up at the falling stars, the ones he had told her about when she was dying. He had stayed outside with her then. He turned, his gray eyes catching the starlight, and looked at her. "Then I'll stay outside with you," he replied. "Every time." Thank you for listening to this story. We hope it brought a little bit of the Old West into your day. We would love to know where in the world you are listening from, so please leave a comment and let us know. Your support means everything, so please consider subscribing to From Wild West. And of course, let us know your thoughts on Clara and Daniel's story in the comments below. We read every one.